My name is Allison Charbonneau, and I am walking you through the article that discussed the research study entitled Outcomes of Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder in Young People with and Without Autism Spectrum Disorder. So, before we start, just some abbreviations that you should be familiar with as we go along. Autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, cognitive cognitive behavior therapy, as well as exposure and response prevention. The purpose of this study was to compare the use of cognitive behavior therapy for the treatment and remission of OCD symptoms in people with and without autism spectrum disorder. There were 44 participants with the average age of 15. There were 22 with OCD and 22 with OCD and ASD. The method included 14 one-hour sessions over 17 weeks, and that behavioral therapy specifically looks like came in three stages: explicit instruction, exposure and response prevention, and relapse prevention. Looking a little more closely at those three elements, explicit instruction is really just that. It's direct instruction to the learner and to the participant about OCD and anxiety, what it is, what it looks like. It's explaining the fight or flight response as well as the OCD hierarchy. This would be very difficult for many young people with autism to be just kind of sat down and explained what OCD and anxiety is. The bulk of the therapy consisted of a treatment called exposure and response prevention, where the participants were basically faced with increasingly challenging fears and given behavioral alternatives. It basically induces anxiety in a controlled environment in order to learn new ways of handling that stress. And then the third element of that behavior therapy is the relapse prevention, which is also very explicit instruction. It's a written blueprint with tools for fighting OCD, as well as having documented goals for the future and documented by the learner. Again, this would be very difficult for individuals on the autism spectrum. So the results are no surprise to me. The group with OCD and autism did not respond well to traditional cognitive behavior treatment. At the end, only 9% were in remission, and 46% of the neurotypical group had reached remission. So there's a number of reasons why the autism group was less likely to be in a state of remission at the end of treatment. Basically, the characteristics of autism seemed to compromise the treatments in ways that made it difficult to qualify the validity of the study itself. Um, Things like self-awareness, flexible thinking, generalization, executive functioning, all of these are lagging skills for people on the spectrum, and all of these are also critical components of cognitive behavior therapy. Ultimately, the findings support a need for more research and development. So consider this for your next study. Could we use some simple modifications that would provide a more level playing field for both groups? Could we get some visual aid to accommodate for nonverbal or more concrete learning styles? In order to improve engagement and attention and motivation, which is really critical for people with autism, could we incorporate some special interests to overcome that? And then instead of really looking at that self-examination process, could we just provide reasonable replacement behavior and maybe repetitive opportunities of practice? Would I use this in my classroom? As it is, no. I see that there's serious limitations. Um, Behavior therapies are very intensive interventions. They're time intensive, resource intensive. And as a public education teacher, there just isn't time to devote that specialized instruction to individuals. And ultimately, there's not enough research. The study was really the first of its kind that looked at individuals on the autism spectrum, um, comparing them to neurodeveloping peers with OCD. Um, and it was a really good study, but it's just not enough to convince me that it's the end all be all treatment for kiddos with autism. But there's always room for application. We certainly use elements that are valuable. They can be incorporated into individual or classroom learning program. There's graded exposure and response prevention is a lot of what we do. It's important for my kiddos that are so rigid to experience some kind of disruption in their routine. And if I can do that in a controlled environment, so then I can teach and support more positive behavioral alternatives. Ultimately, I need to see more research, and I hope that the treatment administration could be tailored more towards individual learning styles.